In this lecture, we're going to be examining the Battle of Ia Drang, which marked a turning point in the war in the way the Vietnam War would be fought, and it also served to introduce an innovative new American military tactic. The Battle of Ia Drang was the first significant encounter between troops of the American Army and North Vietnamese soldiers, the PAVN, during the Vietnam War. The term Ia means river in the local language of the Degar people, were known to the French as the Montagnards. The Battle of Ia Drang also represented a new innovation in American tactics, which is the use of helicopters to create a sort of sky cavalry. The idea of flying troops into combat zones with helicopters is widely practiced today by military forces around the world. However, this was not the case in 1965, and the tactic had yet to be employed in a major combat zone. This image depicts soldiers of the U.S. Army 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry disembarking from a helicopter at landing zone X-ray during the Battle of Ia Drang. U.S. forces were on a search and destroy mission in the Ia Drang Valley. Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore led the American ground forces. This was a two-part battle that took place from November 14th to 18th in 1965. American intelligence had noted the buildup of NVA and Viet Cong forces in the Central Highlands area. These forces had already ambushed a number of ARVN supply convoys and unsuccessfully laid siege to a U.S. Special Forces camp. Immediately after Lieutenant Colonel Moore and his troops arrived at An Khe, the North Vietnamese Army began to prepare for battle. The image on this slide is an aerial view of the 1st Cavalry base at An Khe. This map shows the location of the U.S. base at An Khe, on the edge of the Central Highlands region. The base, which was a little more than 30 miles inland from the port city of Quy Nhon, was close to a number of transportation networks used by both military and civilian traffic. In addition to the search and destroy mission, the U.S. strategy was also to test this new air cavalry tactic, and 3 air cavalry units were deployed for the battle. The NVA strategy was to engage in as much close fighting as possible with its 6 infantry units. There were a total of 6 designated landing zones, also known as LZs, to be used at Ia Drang. Artillery support would be provided from Firebase Falcon, which you can see to the right-hand side of this image. The closest 3 landing zones to the Viet Cong and NVA forces are in green on this particular map. One problem faced by U.S. forces was the sheer size of the Ia Drang Valley, which was over 1,500 square miles. To put this into perspective, the average Ohio county is something like 500 square miles, so the Ia Drang Valley would be equivalent to about 3 Ohio counties. This was also a desolate, sparsely populated region with numerous mountains, hills, and forests. Then there was also the ever-present elephant grass, which brought visibility to just a few feet in places. In addition, temperatures at the time soared to approximately 100 degrees Fahrenheit with extremely high humidity. The NVA and Viet Cong fighters, after heavy fighting with U.S. and ARVN troops in the weeks up to the Battle of Ia Drang, retreated to positions in the Chu Pong Massif. This was an elevated position just a few miles from the Cambodian border in the Central Highlands region that gave the NVA and Viet Cong plenty of places to hide and to set up camp. Early on, some of the platoons, the U.S. platoons, were separated from each other, and in the first few hours, American forces kind of huddled together in a low area surrounded by trees because there were fewer than 200 troops faced off against 1,600 NVA and Viet Cong in the surrounding hills. In particular, landing zone X-ray fell under brutal enemy fire. This was an area about the size of an American football field. The photograph of the battle on this slide was published in Life magazine in 1965. This three-dimensional map shows the difficulties faced at Landing Zone X-Ray. U.S. forces faced enemy forces that outnumbered them over 8-1, and the NVA and Viet Cong troops also enjoyed the advantage of the high ground. Reinforcements began to arrive to support the beleaguered forces at Landing Zone X-Ray. This brought the combatants to a much closer level in terms of numbers. U.S. casualties at Ia Drang were very heavy, with nearly 300 killed in action and over 500 U.S. troops wounded. Initial U.S. estimates of NVA and Viet Cong casualties suggested 3,500 killed and another 1,000 wounded of these 6,000-strong forces. However, the true number of dead NVA and Viet Cong troops is probably closer to 1,300. Both sides, not surprisingly, claimed victory. The U.S. did take out a much larger and significant enemy force, with at least a 5-1 kill ratio, maybe a little higher, and they forced the NVA and Viet Cong out of the valley. American commanders were also pleased with the effectiveness of air cavalry and how it performed. Yet the battle also demonstrated the limits of air cavalry. Once U.S. forces were deployed and on the ground, they were no longer very mobile at all, and a larger enemy force could exact heavy casualties on soldiers unfamiliar with the countryside, and they had much greater mobility. Americans tended to, in these cavalry units, tended to not want to leave the landing zone and fight in areas that are unfamiliar with them. The battle, in part, was also the basis for the film We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson, which was based on a book written by Hal Moore, who was the lieutenant colonel in charge of the 1st Cavalry, who later became a general in the U.S. Army. This brings to a close our look at the Battle of Ia Drang.